Hello, welcome everybody to Network 2020's discussion about illiberalism on the rise with Professor Sheri Berman. My name is Courtney Daugert and I am the president of Network 2020. It is a pleasure to have everyone join us today, and in particular, it's a pleasure to have Sheri Berman with us. A few words about Network 2020 before we begin. We are an inclusive international community. We're a nonprofit, and we bridge the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy community. We really try to highlight and drive innovative solutions to challenges in international affairs. And we do this in a number of different ways. Please do check out all of our other programs in addition to this virtual briefing series. As we've all come to understand, one needs not dig too deep to find examples of countries with illiberal leadership, whether that's folded into democratic rule or as part of an outright autocracy. And as I know, many of us in the United States have concerns about the health of our own democratic institutions. And so today we really want to dig into the trends and mechanics within and behind illiberalism. We want to understand what can history teach us, and does taking a step back to look at the wider scope of democratic development help us better understand where we are today. And so for that reason, we are extremely fortunate to have Dr. Sheri Berman joining us today. She is a professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University, and she has written extensively on the development of democracy, populism, and fascism, including this book right here, The Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe. It is extremely in-depth, well-researched, and has a lot to say about the current moment as well, in addition to history. So thank you so much. Welcome, Sheri. Thank you for joining us today. So to begin, I want to start off with a little bit about terminology, just because I think that there are a lot of words that get thrown around without entirely understanding what their precise definitions are, whether it's, talking about illiberalism and governance, hybrid regime, virtual democracy, electoral democracy, Freedom House has partly free. And then similarly, democracy has many different names and stages, from liberal democracy to a liberal democracy. So when you're looking at the scope of words and terms used to describe your work and your research, what do you think is most important for people to know? And what are there clear dividing lines? You're muted, Sheri.
Sorry about that. So that's a great question. It's always good to sort of start off conversations about what's going on by making sure that we all understand that we're talking about the same things. So as a historically minded political scientist, let me take your question first by stepping back a little bit. So if we were to sort of parachute down into the political world just before the third wave of democracy began, which was in the 70s with the transitions to democracy in Southern Europe, then the wave continues to Latin America, Soviet Empire, yada, yada, yada. So if we were to look at the political world before that, what we would have seen is that the most common type of regime that existed in the world is something that political scientists often refer to as closed autocracy. So those are very repressive regimes where there's no real elections. Individual citizens have very few rights. Repression is a pretty standard tool of governance. So think of, the regimes that existed in the Soviet Empire, military dictatorships in Latin America, things like that. So again, in the early 70s, before this huge wave of democracy, that was the most common type of regime that existed in the world. Now, there were also obviously democracies. Those would be heavily concentrated, obviously, in North America and Western Europe. So the world was much simpler before this most recent wave of political change happened. You essentially would be right if you guessed, nasty repressive dictatorship or fairly well-functioning democracy. Now, we had a huge number of regime changes that began in the 1970s, as I said, Southern Europe, Latin America, and then, of course, the huge wave of democratizations that occurs with the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Now, when we look around the world today, it's much messier. It's much less clear-cut in a way than the world of the Cold War, the pre-Third Wave world was. Why? Well, we have a lot of regimes that are sort of democratic, right? Relatively well functioning, still North America and Western Europe. But now we've got a lot of regimes that kind of mix things, right? That sort of have elections. They're not really free and fair. And citizens are much freer, certainly, than they would have been under dictatorships, military dictatorships in Latin America, communist dictatorships in Central Asia, Russia, Eastern Europe, but clearly not as free. Their leaders not as subject to electoral recall as we think of in democracies in Western Europe and North America. So we have now a whole variety of what are sort of in-between regime types. So now people talk about liberal democracies. Those are democracies that combine the features of liberalism and democracy. I can talk more about why those two things should not be conflated. We have some regimes that people refer to as electoral democracies. Okay, they're elections, they're relatively free and fair, but the liberal aspects of democracy are not fully there. Separation of powers, independent courts, minority and individual rights are fully protected, things like that. Now, interestingly today, this is a long-winded answer. Interestingly today, the most common regime type that we have in the world, if you think of what political scientists how political scientists analyze these things, is something that's called an electoral autocracy. And this was very uncommon before the third wave. An electoral autocracy seems like a contradiction in terms, but what it is a regime where there are elections, but they're not really free and fair. That is to say, there are oppositions, there's some civil society, citizens have the right to vote, they're not overly surveilled or subject to overt violence as they would have been in the 1970s. But those elections, the oppositions are really hindered in some very significant ways. So if you think about countries like Turkey, Hungary, India today, those are countries, again, those are electoral autocracies. And if you were to, again, to sort of parachute down into the world from an alien planet, that would be the regime type that is now most common. And so it's this kind of weird mixed regime. We still have closed autocracies. We have the China, which is much more autocratic even than it was 10 years ago. And of course, the crazy places like North Korea and military dictatorships that still exist. But these electoral autocracies that kind of combine a little bit of different things, these are now the most common regime type. And so it is actually confusing when you look at the world, because sometimes it's kind of difficult to know, what you're looking at. In 1970, you would have known this is a democracy, this is a dictatorship. Today, we've got a lot of betwixt in between.
Thank you. And that explains why it's so easy to mix up those terminologies. So thank you for setting us straight. Last year, you wrote that in recent years, democracy has been under siege. Since 2015, the number of countries that have been experiencing democratic backsliding has outstripped the numbers of those that are democratizing. So looking back, when did, and you started to touch on this a little bit, but when did liberal democracy become the norm? And then how did we get to this age of autocratization?
Okay, so that's another great question. So as I mentioned already, and as I'm sure most of your participants are aware since they're here, we had this wave of democracy that begins to sweep across the globe in the middle of the 1970s, again, Southern Europe, Latin America, and then the big shift, which comes with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire. The only part of the world that is really immune to that wave is the Middle East, right, which has its own very brief springtime of the peoples in, the 2010 period, but otherwise is the only area of the world that doesn't fall under this democratic wave. So if you were to look at the number of democracies that existed across the globe, right, it goes up until about 2010. And then it begins to level off. So today, you have more countries that are moving backwards, that is to say, that are moving from the democratic away from the democratic category towards the autocratic category. It doesn't mean they're there yet, but it means they are becoming, the characteristics of democracy are becoming fewer, weaker, that kind of thing. Now, so we have an undertow, which makes perfect sense because we use the term wave for a reason, right? The imagery that that's supposed to bring up in your mind is obviously, okay, it's January in New York, but still we can all imagine a beach. A wave is a huge movement, right, of particles, water particles, whatever, going together, cresting up, in this case, in the democratic category, but there has to be an undertow. And historically, all other waves of democratization have been followed by an undertow. So from a historical perspective, the fact that many countries that made transitions have not done so well, that is not, in fact, surprising. So if you're historically minded, you would have expected the undertow for reasons that we can discuss. And there surely has been one. And again, from 2010 on, we've had more countries moving backwards, if you want to use a sort of teleological perspective, than moving into the democratic category. That said, I think it is still very important to note that if you're just looking at numbers, or for that matter, even population percentages, we still obviously have many more countries that are democratic, more people living on democracies in 2022, surely than we did before the third wave, but we're back to the levels of about, the late 1990s. That is to say, after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but not, with the further parts of that wave that, go again up into the early part of the 21st century. So we're definitely in a period where the undertow now is stronger than the wave itself, but historically, we are still, in a comparative perspective, much more democratic of a globe than we've been at any time in the past, with the exception of the height of this wave, like I said, which is about 2010.
Thank you. You mentioned, you started to touch on history, and so I wanted to talk about your book a little bit. It's extremely well researched. I mean, you're going, way into a lot of different developments that happened on the continent. And I assume that it's one, because you're a professor of history, and so this is something that's very interesting to you, but I also assume that there's another reason to do it. And so why do we need to understand this history of democratic development? And conversely, what is the risk of not understanding that?
So I'm actually a political scientist, not a historian. The historians would be very upset, but that's fine. I'm a historian, not a political scientist. That's fine. So why do it this way? Well, first of all, I think that history provides us with a really crucial, essential perspective on understanding the present day. And if we're just going to think about this from a democratic perspective, right, I think that's clear. I already mentioned one important thing that we should recognize, right? Which is waves have undertows. So while we should be saddened by the fact that there are countries moving away from democracy, we should not be surprised. Okay, so if anybody remembers their history, 1918, 1945, 1848, these were all previous waves of democracy, right? If you looked at the world in 1918 or 1945 or in 1848, you would be incredibly optimistic. Oh my goodness, dictatorships are falling, new democracies emerging, this is great, right? And then if you sort of plopped yourself down, some years later, you'd be depressed as all heck. Why? Because many of those new democracies failed, right? So on the one hand, right, just from the perspective of democracy, we should not be surprised by the undertow. But from a deeper causal perspective, right, why is it that there are undertows? It's not just saying that history repeats itself is not, I mean, it may be valuable, but it's superficial, right? So if you see a historical pattern, the next thing that you should be doing is looking for the reasons for that pattern. Does it exist? Are there causal reasons for that pattern to exist? And surely there are. Why? Because despite the way it appears initially, overthrowing dictatorships turns out to be a lot easier than building democracies, right? And so, when you see a dictatorship, you're thinking, oh my God, this is sturdy. It has control of an immense repressive surveillance apparatus. The opposition is divided and weak, and you think, how is it going to disappear? And these are true things, but again, it is easier to get rid of these dictatorships than it is to build a democracy, because a democracy requires a whole range of institutional and normative infrastructure to work. And so the reason why there are undertows is because many of the countries that manage to overthrow dictatorships can't build don't have the necessary institutional, normative, and other preconditions to make democracy work. And so the reason why I wrote the book this way, or one reason why I wrote the book this way, and one reason why I think even if you're a political scientist interested in the present day, you need to understand history, is it's very difficult to know what should surprise you and what shouldn't, where you should be looking for causal relationships, and where things are just spurious, right? So we know there are undertows. So what should we be looking for? Which are the countries where we would most likely expect to see decay? Why are the reasons why we use this, or people have used this term wave, precisely because you understand in retrospect, right? You don't see it at the time, but in retrospect, overthrowing those dictatorships turns out to be the first step on a very long and difficult path. It's not the end of the story, it's the beginning. And if you don't know history, you won't recognize that pattern, and you won't know to look for the reasons for why those patterns exist.
So then, jumping off that point, how do well-functioning democracies emerge and thrive? And what circumstances facilitate the rise of illiberal practices within these democracies?
So that's a huge question, and one on about which probably hundreds, thousands of books and even more articles have been written. So I mean, I'll throw out some things to think about, but that's it's a really difficult, it's the important question, right? So I already mentioned that democracy requires a whole range of institutional and normative preconditions. I think most people recognize that when they think about it. Okay, so what does that mean? We need, whatever, separation of powers, well-functioning courts, rule of law, civilian control of the military, norms of political equality, right? Democracy does not require all citizens be economically equal. That may be desirable depending on your political viewpoint, but you do need to accept that everyone who is a member of your national community has the same political rights and responsibilities. You need to accept that leaders are responsive to citizens. Elites in society have to recognize that they are there to act as public servants, not as sort of separate entities who have a right to power separate from their representative function. So all of those things are necessary. They're not sufficient, and they are not easy things to construct. Beyond that, there are a whole range of societal and economic conditions or variables that social scientists point to, right? So, one thing that we're debating a lot today in the West, in the United States, is how much economic inequality is consistent with the political equality that is a necessity for democracy, right? Again, democracy does not require equality of income, but it does require that economic resources not be translated into political ones, right? So citizens must be politically equal, right? Okay, how to interpret that is not necessarily clear, but you can have economic resources translated into political resources, right? And so questions of economic equality and economic conditions also affect the functioning of democracy. Similarly, social conditions, right? Where you cannot have political equality in a society that is extremely socially stratified. Why? Again, because political equality is necessary for democracy. And if social status translates, again, directly into political resources, you're not dealing with democratic conditions. So all of these things need to be there to make democracy work well, right? To have, and we may want to talk a little bit more about this term, a really well-functioning liberal democracy, right? And so, having all of those things, constructing all of those things, developing all of those things, that is a lot, right? And it took in the West, hundreds of years for that to happen, right? If we think about, the European case, which is the one that my book is about, right? Our first real attempt at democracy in Europe, the start of the modern political era, is the French Revolution, right? 1789. France, much less Europe, doesn't get a really stable, well-functioning democracy until the Fifth Republic, right? It's called the Fifth Republic because, there were 4 tries before that. And if you know anything about French history, even that number does not sufficiently capture the amount of, conflict and chaos that characterizes France from 1789 up through the post-war era. The United States, we think of as being a democracy from its origins, but of course, comparatively, that is not true. I mean, we had a civil war up through that point. Obviously, a significant part of our country is an oligarchic aristocracy. It is not a democracy. And up until the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, a significant percentage of American citizens were denied full political equality, were denied their democratic rights. And so the United States also cannot be considered a full, well-functioning liberal democracy up through, at the very least, the 1960s. So, again, taking that earlier question, history is important, right? It makes us understand how long, how hard, how difficult that road to democracy is. And therefore, when we look at countries that made transitions in the late 20th, early 21st century, who've not had democratic experience in the past, and we think, oh my goodness, look how messed up they are. Well, I mean, again, if you parachuted yourself into France 20 years after the French Revolution, things were kind of messy. So again, it takes a lot to make democracy work, a lot.
Thank you. I know that was a big question. I want to kind of keep chipping away at it in a slightly different way too. You talked about sort of what constitutes a liberal democracy. I'd like to just turn a little bit and ask, what are some of the main symptoms or criteria that start to constitute an illiberal advance? So when you're kind of zooming in on the sequencing of things, how does that look?
So again, that's a great question. And it also perhaps enables us to loop back to some of to an earlier question that you asked, right? So sometimes you'll hear the term democracy used, electoral democracy sometimes, and liberal democracy. So why are those two terms used? Is it just that social scientists are being sloppy and they like jargon? Well, social scientists can be sloppy, they do like jargon, but here there's a reason for it, right? So liberalism, again, for maybe some of you can remember if you took political theory classes or whatever in college, right? Liberalism refers to something very specific, right? And in this context, what it means is all of those sort of liberal rights that you talk about when you are thinking about liberal theory, liberal thinkers, right? And in many ways, liberalism is a constraint on democracy. It says you can elect leaders in governments, but they can't do certain things, right? They're not allowed to take away the rights, certain rights of citizens, right? In the American context, we call them inalienable rights, right? We have a Bill of Rights precisely because our founding fathers were like, look, these are things actually that the government cannot do, right? They should not infringe on these things. We are taking these things, so to speak, out of the democratic process, out of the reach of majority rule, right? So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of organization, all of these things, right? So liberalism is a place that is a set of rights, a set of liberties, if you want to think about it that way, that individuals have, right, that are not supposed to be subject to the electoral process, at least not directly, right? And so when we talk about a liberal democracy, we mean a country that doesn't only have free and fair elections, and that's a lot. Free and fair elections, the free and fair part is important, right? It means there's a real opposition. It means there's at the very least some freedom of the press, right? Because without those things, elections are, free and fair elections don't mean anything, right? But a liberal democracy is more than that, right? It's a democracy, it's a political system that respects, that nurtures all of these other things that we associate with liberalism. And so it is perfectly possible, and indeed many social scientists think about what's going on in places like the United States today, right, as an erosion first and foremost of some of those liberal values, right? A lack of respect for some of the things that liberalism is supposed to entail. And that, so you would think of this as a democracy, but perhaps not a fully liberal one, which is why you often, as you said, hear the term illiberal democracy or illiberalism. And just to throw this out there, maybe to clarify a little bit, there's a reason why someone like Viktor Orban refers to his regime as illiberal, because he doesn't like liberal values, but he likes to think of himself as a popular leader, as a leader who reflects the will of his people.
Thank you. You referenced what's happening in the United States today, and I'd love to just follow up on that a little bit. In your opinion, does what's happening in the US, at least according to some people, does that threat stem more from the strengths of illiberal movements, or is it the weaknesses of liberal principles?
So I would say that, I mean, you could think of it in both ways. The way I would characterize it is we are living in a situation where people have sorted themselves into political parties that are much more homogenous in some ways, particularly on the Republican side, than they were in the past. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you were to go back to the 70s or the post-war decades, you had two political parties that were composed of much more diverse coalitions than they are today. So you had religious folks in both parties. You had rural and urban folks in both parties. You even had conservatives and liberals in both parties, because of course, up through the post-war decades, you had conservative Southern Democrats, and you of course had liberal Republicans from, the coasts and that kind of thing. And so the parties had profiles, but they were mixtures of people. And what's really happened over the last several decades is that has really changed, right? So, if you were to tell me I am a Caucasian person who is highly religious, living in a non-coastal area, and I consider myself conservative, I would be able to know that you are almost certainly a Republican. And that's not a normative judgment about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It just means that our parties now, people who affiliate with, or who rather identify with parties, are much more homogenous. This is more true in the Republican side. The Democratic side is still a kind of coalition in the sense that you do have some voters who are conservative on some things, but they are minority voters. And so they are in the Democratic coalition just because of reasons, we could also discuss. Now, why is this problematic? Because it becomes much easier for the two parties to see themselves as entirely distinct. And indeed, they are much more ideologically homogenous, as I said, people living in different areas. So when you look at those maps on presidential election day, I mean, you have coasts that are one color and much of the rest of the country that is not. And people have sorted themselves geographically. Again, if we look at housing patterns over the last several decades, people are much more likely to live in areas surrounded by people like themselves, interacting with people like themselves. And so we have really become, in that sense, a much more polarized country, with Republican and Democratic now meaning very different things. And when you see someone on the other side as really different from you, having few overlaps with you as far as, again, where you live, what your political ideology is, what your religious affiliation is, maybe even what your skin color is, it becomes very easy to see that person as not just your opponent, but as someone who is very threatening, who is potentially dangerous. And that becomes a very, very bad situation for democratic politics, small d, democratic politics.
Thank you. We are getting a lot of good questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to ask one more, and then I'll start to weave in those questions. So we've talked a little bit about, we've touched on democratic backsliding, which is a term that just keeps cropping up. Are there any cases where we can see signs of authoritarian backsliding in the world today?
So that's a great question, actually, because one of the things that's happened at the same time as this undertow is we've had, I mean, obviously the pandemic was a little bit of a, well, not a little bit, but was a blip, but a huge rise in protests as well. So if you were to look at the last, I don't know, whatever, 5 years, one thing you would notice for sure is this undertow, absolutely. But the other thing you would notice if you were a social scientist who looked at these things is a huge explosion of protests, right? And those protests are everywhere, but they are disproportionately located in countries, precisely as you said, where authoritarians are either trying to become more authoritarian, or leaders, again, that were sort of in that gray category, are trying to crack down. So we have absolutely seen that. I mean, if you look at the newspaper, you see it in places ranging from Kazakhstan to, okay, the United States, parts of Western Europe, against things that are seen as problematic from a democratic perspective. So absolutely, also, in a more quotidian but perhaps more direct way, we have absolutely seen some leaders who are worried about their positions, facing some real opposition. So two countries that I mentioned earlier, classic examples of electoral autocracy today, right? Turkey and Hungary, right? Orban is facing an election in April. For the first time in a very long time, despite a very uneven playing field, there is a chance he could lose that election. Turkey too, we saw actually some very significant advances made by the opposition a year or so ago in those mayoral elections. Erdogan's party lost, for instance, the mayoralty of Istanbul. That's a big deal. He's now he's having a variety of problems because of economic mismanagement. We see protests, we see dissatisfaction. So absolutely, protests have been another very marked feature of our last several years. And again, they are disproportionately directed towards leaders who were seen as not being in line with popular aspirations.
Great, thank you. And regarding the protests, we did a talk on that sometime in this last pandemic year. So Brian, if you can find the link and put it in the chat, I would appreciate it. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A box now. Thank you so much, Sheri. I'm seeing a lot of fantastic questions in here, so I'm just going to jump right in. So the first question is, to what extent does the rise of illiberalism reflect the limitations of democratic systems to address the increasing complexity of challenges that require national global action consensus, such as climate change?
So it's a great question. I mean, and it actually provides a very good perspective, I think, on how to understand what's going on today, right? Which is, look, democracies, governments more generally, should be responsive to their citizens, right? And so, if you look around the world, in addition to seeing the rise of illiberalism, of populist movements in the United States and Western Europe, people are really dissatisfied. And whatever you think about their responses, right? You don't like the parties they vote for, you think they're nasty or, whatever. There's absolutely, dissatisfaction has a cause. Right? That is to say that if we look at the West in particular, we have seen things like rising economic inequality and insecurity, dramatic social, cultural, demographic changes. I mean, it is the job of leaders and governments to respond to change. I mean, that's, sort of one way of looking at democracy. We elect you, our leaders and our governments, to deal with our problems. And when leaders and governments are seen as not being responsive, right? Neither understanding nor coming up with solution to problems, dissatisfaction rises. This is straightforward. And people become when they're dissatisfied, they become willing to listen to a whole variety of things, maybe that they shouldn't. They become willing to vote for parties that are anti-establishment and perhaps even extremist. So, I mean, I think that is a very good thing for us to think about, right? Which is, this rising dissatisfaction is not exactly the same as a vote for an illiberal or a populist party, but it is certainly a precondition for that. And we are living in a world, I think, today that does have a very, very large number of problems. Again, social problems, cultural change, economic change, global challenges like, pandemics and climate change. And if you're looking around and the people that you voted for are not doing their job, yeah, you're going to see dissatisfaction with existing parties. You're going to see even dissatisfaction with democracy. So I absolutely think that that's a nice way to kind of get at some of the issues that we have been, grappling with, which is we are living in a time of significant change on many levels, and governments unfortunately seem to be over their heads in a lot of places.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question is, in what ways are the current challenges to democratic norms and institutions in the United States similar to or different from the challenges globally?
Well, I think it's different. There's some similarities, but let me stress some of the differences. First of all, we have a lot of political problems in this country. I mentioned a bunch of them. I'm sure everybody who's listening are fully aware of them. But, for better or worse, this has been something resembling a democracy for a very long time. So our institutions, for instance, are stronger and our norms are stronger than they are in countries that, let's say, again, made transitions during the third wave, in the late 20th or early 21st century. So we have faced some very significant challenges to our democracy over the last years. And our institutions and our norms have held. That doesn't mean they will in the future. These things are fragile and need to be constantly cultivated. But, we have managed to deal with a lot of threats, challenges to our democracy. And, at this point, we still remain that way. So the fact that we have that foundation that we can rely on is something that we shouldn't take for granted, but that we're different from, let's say, again, you're sort of Hungary or you're Turkey or you're Russia in that way. But we are similar in that, again, this is really, I think, it's hard to be fully objective, but I feel confident enough saying that we are living in a time of really, really very significant change, right? And the thing is that this change is multi-tiered, right? Significant economic change, significant social and cultural change, significant technological change. And that is creating really a lot of challenges, a lot of problems for governments to deal with. And so, here in the United States, we are very privileged. We're a wealthy country. We're still remain the most powerful country. But these are a lot of challenges for societies and for leaders and governments to deal with at once. And I think, a lot of the political dissatisfaction that we see, a lot of the polarization that we see, a lot of the sort of social unease and resentment that we see has to be traced back to the fact that we are just living in, I think, objectively quite a period of quite dramatic change.
Thank you. You spoke earlier about the long arc that it took in France to get to a point where it was actually a democracy, and then also the changes that we're going through right now. And so the next question is someone who wants to know whether or not was liberalism, was it just a bump in history, limited in space and time?
Liberalism or liberal democracy, or did the person not clarify?
They say liberalism, but I think we could probably take a look at both.
So, I mean, that's sort of a perennial question that has been debated since the third wave and since Frank Fukuyama's sort of classic end of history article. I am a firm believer in democracy, not only from a normative perspective. I have no problem declaring myself a big, supporter of small d democracy. But I also think that it is not a culturally bound thing to say that most people want to have a say in shaping their own and their country's fates. And also that most people believe, at least in the abstract, in political equality, if not social and economic equality. And, even if you take those two very basic, simple assertions or assumptions, democracy is really the only system that is consistent with that. Now, people have other goals and other things that they want in their lives too: economic security, actual security, a whole variety of other things. And there comes many times in history when they feel like they have to choose, right? Like, either I'm going to have a government that is going to protect me and generate economic growth, or I'm going to have one that's democratic. You don't want to put people in that situation because, those are equally valid goals. But if you assume that all things being equal, again, all people, doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter what your background, prefer to be able to direct their own lives, have a say in directing the lives of their community, and want to be treated as politically equal to, their neighbor, regardless of the size of the house that he or she lives in, then I think that democracy is not a historical blip in that aspirational sense. However, given how much it takes to work, and this is something we've already discussed, we have to recognize how very fragile it is, how much it actually takes to keep it working well. So I don't believe it's going to disappear because people all of a sudden will lose an interest in that type of political regime. But I do think we are at a time when, given the dangers that democracy faces, even in countries where it's long established or relatively long established, like the United States, Western Europe, we have to recognize that if we want to keep this system, a whole variety of things need to be paid attention to that I think we sort of forgot were necessary because we took democracy for granted over the last several decades.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Claude Buechner, and he asks, social media in particular, and the internet in our pockets in general, have been blamed for this shift to liberalism. Can you please share with us any insights you have gleaned in this regard from your research?
So these are obviously great questions. What's very funny, I mean, I don't know how old the question asker is. I'm relatively old, right? So I can remember, not that long ago when everybody was like, oh my God, new technology, social media, this is the most democratizing technological innovation that has happened in recent times, because not only does it democratize access to information, but it also enables people to interact with each other in many more varied and easy ways. And now all of a sudden, Facebook is the enemy of democracy. Now, I don't actually think either one of these perspectives is incorrect. Perhaps again, because I'm historically minded, I think of this as I think of a lot of other great technological revolutions, which is that when they're in their relatively early phases, they seem to be, sort of driving history rather than having political forces constrain or control them. I think that when we think of stuff like social media, new means of communication, I think that they can act as an accelerant for all kinds of things. So they still are an incredible resource for people, again, we talked about before, who want to protest, who want to put together movements, oppositional movements. They're not very good at creating long standing ties or institutionalized movements, but they are incredibly good at getting information and getting information out there and making connections. But they can also be used to spread disinformation. They can be used to link people up who we would rather they stayed in their little black holes rather than find, people who think like them. So I think right now what we have is a technology that has good and bad sides, positive and negative uses, and we haven't quite figured out as a people how to give the right signals to our leaders and governments about what kinds of controls, if any, should be put on these things. And so we're frustrated, right? Because all of a sudden we now see, Facebook and Twitter or some people do, as horribly evil. But clearly that's an overreaction to a complete and utter lack of regulation. And I think we are now in the sort of perhaps advanced beginning stages of groping towards a discussion as a society, as a people, of how we want these communication technologies to become a more permanent part of our political and social lives. But I don't think we're there yet.
Great, thank you. A question from Joanna Waszewski, who asks, is there anything countries with rising democracies can do to minimize the undertow challenge?
So that's a great question. So look, I like to believe that agency is a thing, that countries' political fates are not determined by, giant structural factors outside of the control. How wealthy is your country? What part of the world is it in? That kind of thing. So look, what can leaders do? Well, that's relatively straightforward. How do we make them do that? Don't take power that you're not supposed to have. Don't undermine your opponents. Keep separation of powers as something that, even though you don't like your friends your colleagues in Parliament or Congress, it's important that they are separate from you. Recognize that civil society, no matter how obstreperous and obnoxious, is a necessary part of democracy. One anecdote I will throw out there, which just popped into my mind because I was discussing with some friends earlier, is, if you were to go back to the very early stages of American history, probably one of the most important things, and we all learned about this again in history class, is that George Washington decided essentially not to turn himself from our first president into a monarch. Now, we sort of take that as, perhaps not important. That was such an important decision, right? When institutions and norms are young and weak, they are very malleable, right? And Washington could have, by all of the things that we learned, he might very well have decided to pull Orban or Maduro or something like that and decide to change the Constitution or change the rules of the game as they existed at that point to stay longer. He did not. So recognize that the system is more important than you are, no matter how much you dislike your opponents and what the people who aren't voting for you think.
Great answer. Question from Stephen Maley, who asks, there is a lot of talk about illiberal democracy, such as in Hungary. Is there such a thing as liberal authoritarian regime, whether in the arena of sovereign states or in quasi-federal constructs?
Mm-hmm. So great. There was a wonderful article written some years ago by Fareed Zakaria on this question, right? And he was very keen on what he called, again, liberal regimes that were not democratic, right? Historically, he pointed to Britain before the advent of universal suffrage, and then to what at that point, the Lee Kuan Yew model. So look, are there examples of that in history? Yeah, and I would say those would be the two best one, right? Britain after the Glorious Revolution, but before universal suffrage. You could call that a liberal, but certainly it was not a democratic regime. And sure, Lee Kuan Yew was a thing, right? You know, Singapore is an incredible success story. I think that is not a really stable regime type for a variety of reasons, but you could imagine it. Just like you could have a democracy that is illiberal, you could have an authoritarian regime that is liberal. The problem is that authoritarian regimes, once you don't have those checks on power, right, either from checks and balances within various parts of government or from elections, it is the very rare individual who decides to not amass power, or the very rare party that does not decide to amass more power for themselves. And so I don't think that's a stable regime type, because I think there are very few the political equivalent of Mother Teresa's out there. If you look at all of the dictators who come to power claiming that they are just going to clean up their countries and, you know, get them right back on track and put in place the rule of law and get economic growth going, and then, you know, they're going to turn their country over to the people. Yeah, there's just not a lot of examples of that. So theoretically, yes. Empirically, I would say that is not a real thing.
All right, thank you. Question from Elon Gilbert. Why do electoral autocracies bother with elections, especially where these often lead to serious unrest?
So I would say actually that this is a backhanded compliment to democracy, which is that since the third wave, it has become much less legitimate for governments to just simply pretend that they don't represent the will of the people, that they are completely and utterly autocratic. Those regimes still exist. China, you know, again, the horrible North Korea, but it is very hard for governments to now completely do away with the trappings of democracy. And I think that is, again, a backhanded compliment to how much democracy has, to get back to a previous question, kind of won, at least at the abstract level, right? So, you know, no matter how bad it is to live in Hungary or even Russia today, it's a hell of a lot better than living in Russia under Stalin or in Hungary under the communist regime. And I think this reflects the fact that really pushing back towards a truly repressive, truly non-representative regime, that's very hard to do in most, not all, but in most of the countries that made even failed transitions during the third wave. So I think this is a reflection of a discrepancy between what is considered legitimate and what the reality on the ground is. There are probably other reasons, but I would suggest thinking about that as an important one.
Great, thank you. Omar Ocampo asks, can you really have an accessible liberal democracy when it takes an enormous amount of financial resource, millions of dollars, just to be a candidate in an election? Or does it simply become a commodified product captured by a politically active, wealthy elite?
So, I mean, this gets to debates, obviously, that are very pronounced in the United States, right? Which is that, does the fact that our courts have interpreted the right to spend money, donations on elections as freedom of speech, right? Does that compromise either who runs for elections or the kinds of representatives that we have? So, look, I mean, this is a very difficult question. I will say that empirically, what we have seen over the past years is that the type of people running for office, especially since Citizens United, and winning are really not representative in some, at least superficial sense, which is to say they tend to be much wealthier than the average person. Great studies have been done, right? So for instance, the number of working class candidates who are running for office and winning offices really has dropped dramatically in the United States. And that is because, again, you know, to run for office these days, you have to already have a pretty significant network of people that you can call on, and you have to know how to sort of raise money. And that's just not something that's really going to be done very easily by working class candidates. So there's simply no doubt that there is a very least a significant trade-off in having the kind of electoral system we have in the United States. And that doesn't mean politics is perfect in other places that have public financing. It does mean, though, that we need to think very carefully as a country about the trade-offs. And at the very least, and we could get into this much further, superficially, it does indeed skew who runs for office and who wins.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Our next question is from Bill Edelson, and he asks, if you could wave a magic wand today and change the US to improve small d democracy, what changes would you make? Is it term limits on the Supreme Court? Is it defend or repeal the filibuster? Other changes? What would you propose?
So that's a great question. Obviously, also, these are all great questions. I mean, so from the short term, some of the things that, you know, just mentioned might help, right? So I don't know, term limits. I personally might put certain limits on the way in which campaigns are financed, the way in which money flows into politics in other ways. But I think the longer term problems, right, the deeper problems really are in our society itself, right? We simply cannot, you know, we could get rid of the filibuster tomorrow. We could reform the Electoral College. We could put some sort of, you know, I don't know, perhaps compromise limits legislation on donations to elections and money in politics. But if we don't figure out a way to kind of get citizens to interact with people who are different than themselves more, to not see each other as opponents, to kind of pull away from some of these kind of culture war types of approaches to politics, all of these institutional changes are really, I don't think, going to be able to make a huge difference. I'm not sure how that happens, but ultimately that is what it's going to take to make democracy work better in this country, right? We cannot have two political parties where, you know, we each partisans of each party, and not everybody is a partisan, but partisans of each party really feel like having the other party in power is not just, okay, look, my taxes are going to be higher or lower, welfare state's going to be bigger or smaller, who cares over the long term, but that these people are actually a threat to your way of life. That is not a situation in which democracy can work well. And so ultimately, if we really want to fix things in this country, we have to figure out a way to kind of get citizens not to see each other in that way. And that has to do with civil society. It has to do with getting back to the media question. But that is ultimately really where the deep-seated problems lie. And if you care about small d democracy, that's the kind of stuff that, you know, you should be really trying to do something about.
Thank you. We have some questions from Nikita Kozhemyakin. I'm going to try to pull them together, and apologies, Nikita, if I'm misrepresenting your question. But he's asking about the relationship between liberalism as an instrument of realpolitik, and sort of when the rubber hits the road, can the ideology, is it actually, you know, what does it say about the institutions, the laws, and the way that it actually is enacted on the ground?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what.
I'm not sure I completely understand the question either. If we want, we can skip over it. I was trying to piece it together because I didn't want to ignore it, but since I'm not able to fully get it, and Nikita, if you want to rephrase it and put it in the question, please feel free to do that. So the next question that I wanted to ask is from John Katska. He asks, we are in the process of moving from the industrial to the information age, a time of great disruption. Oh, sorry, this is actually that's not the question that I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask this one about that you had substituted identity with or affiliate with when you're discussing the evolution of American politics. Is it fair to say that, I'm so sorry, I'm not getting this question either. I apologize. I'm gonna get to another question that I can read properly. I apologize. Okay, so with respect to protests and other demonstrations, you suggested that they indicate the presence of undertow and genuine resistance to authoritarianism. How do you view the suggestion that intense protest, especially in the streets, actually signifies the last days of democracy, such as Hong Kong?
Okay, so I mean, Hong Kong is actually an example again of protests that were against autocratization. That is to say, China's clamping down on Hong Kong's, you know, self-determination liberal rights there, et cetera, et cetera. So that is, that's what that was. I think, as much as we can perhaps admire what was going on in Hong Kong, I mean, that's there you have a small territory that no matter how cross-sectional and vociferous those protests were, you have a regime that is just overwhelmingly powerful. So those protests were fighting really immense odds. Protests have managed to make a difference in other places. I mean, we have seen protests really matter in places like Poland. We had significant protests that clearly must have influenced the powers that be with regards to certain laws, certain interactions with the European Union. We've of course seen protests in the recent past that have actually overthrown dictatorial regimes. I mentioned the Arab Spring. That's quite a way in the back. Now seems like a long time ago, but was not. And in other dictatorships as well. And in the United States, obviously we had protests that were completely legitimate. It is completely legitimate for citizens to peacefully protest whatever the heck they want. And that is a way outside of elections for citizens to have their voices heard. And we should see that as a important part of democracy, not a threat to it. So protests can be actually helpful. And I think in truly democratic systems, they're a way, again, for citizens to make their voices heard, to try to influence politicians and parties. But they can be effective in dictatorships. It depends on a variety of factors: how large they are, how cross-sectional they are, how sustained and organized they are, whether or not they can give rise to more institutionalized movements over time. But yeah.
Probably last question. In what ways would the further weakening of democracy in the United States likely impact geopolitics and the stability of democratic values and institutions elsewhere around the globe?
So look, there's no doubt that the United States, as still the strongest democracy in the world, has a huge impact on the fate of democracy worldwide. It does that in different ways. One is, and really important, is through its example. Right? So there's simply no doubt that during the post-war era, when the United States was not only, the strongest democracy, but was economically successful, seemed, haltingly, but able to deal with some of its underlying social problems and inequities, that this was a positive thing for democracy worldwide, right? The democracy that was the most important one seemed to be flourishing to some degree. As the United States flounders and we look less attractive as a model, that is also important indirectly, because it enables non-democratic regimes to tout their own achievements, and it makes democracy look less attractive. But it matters directly, right? The weaker we are, the less likely we are to actively support democracy. And by that, I don't mean invading other countries. I mean being able to provide assistance, being able to provide advice that is taken, not as a sign of hypocrisy, right? But as a sign of strength. And so the weakening of the United States really does have a very important, both direct and indirect impact on the fate of democracy worldwide, which is why, we should all care about our own democracy if you're American, because this is the place where you live and our futures depend on it. But also, if you care about freedom in the world, a stronger United States is a positive force. Again, not necessarily, not in the sense of going out and conquering other countries, but in the sense of providing a model that, looks attractive to people who are struggling with repressive, unfree regimes of their own.
And that seems like a good place to stop. Sheri, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate just the depth that you went into with so many of these different questions. And thank you to the audience. These were really phenomenal questions. I really enjoyed getting to read them. Our next event will be Tuesday, February 1st from 12 to 1. We will have Rachel Brunson, the president and CEO of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, interviewing Scott Sagan. about nuclear disarmament, the future of nuclear weapons. It should be a really great talk, especially since the Bulletin is right about now releasing their doomsday clock. So it should be a really interesting conversation to have. So Sheri, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, and take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.